Committee. I thank you for volunteering to support AGU's honors program. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules today for this very important workshop. As we move forward with honors and recognition in AGU, it's important that we take opportunities like this to understand
is representative of who we are and is fundamentally important to who we aspire to be.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry, hold on. Excuse me. For those who are joining, please mute your microphone, please. I'm sorry, Latoya, if you want to just go ahead and start over with the welcome remarks, I apologize.
Yeah, sure. No problem. On behalf of Honors and Recognition Committee, I want to thank you for joining us today. And I personally want to thank you for volunteering with the honors program, giving of your time and talents with AGU Honors. Today, we have a workshop where we're going to learn more about biases in decision making. And we appreciate all of you for your dedication and commitment to your various committees and subcommittees and to improving the honors program and ensuring that we are evolving our honors program and recognitions just as we evolve our science. Thank you so much for your time. Billy, the virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Latoya. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are. So today we're very happy to have Dr. Stephanie A. Goodwin leading today's workshop webinar. Stephanie is the founder of Inclusion Works, an organization that works across the US, especially in leading institutional change. She is also a very, very close partner with our AGU DEI staff, diversity and inclusion staff, for DEI programming to all AGU members. So some of you may have interfaced with Stephanie in her facilitation of the very highly popular Speaking Up workshops. So these workshops have been delivered to more than 30 university and professional societies across the US, but that's not why she's here today. So Stephanie is an elected fellow of the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. She has more than 20 years of experience in higher education as a scientist, educator, and academic leader with expertise in diversity, inclusion, science, faculty development, and academic affairs. So before we start, our format today is to have approximately 25, maybe 30 minutes of presentation, followed by Q&A. So we welcome you again to write in the chat box at any point as the webinar progresses, but to please remain on mute and hold your questions for the Q&A period at the end. So that will be a chance where you can follow up anything that's in the chat and talk directly with Stephanie to answer any questions. And we do plan to end this session at about in 45 minutes. But after that, there will be a reminder that not only is the session being recorded, but there will be follow-up educational modules posted online for more details after today. So with that, I'm going to close and turn it over to Stephanie. Welcome, Stephanie. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Billy. Can everyone hear me? Did my mic come on? Excellent. So thank you for inviting me and for having me here to support this discussion. As Billy suggested, the materials I'll share with you today are framed around AGU's commitment to ethical and inclusive decision-making and a series of modules that we're developing to support that commitment across the enterprise, if you will. So why are we here today? Well, we're here today because research suggests that biases persist in STEM, including in the geosciences. And although the representation of women has reached gender parity in terms of educational outcomes, including doctoral degree attainment, nevertheless, women remain underrepresented in geoscience careers, both within and beyond academic settings. Moreover, as Bernard and Huberdeck noted in their 2018 analysis of educational outcomes, there's been no progress when it comes to racial and ethnic diversity in the geosciences for about 40 years. Now, evidence of persistent barriers to success for underrepresented groups can be found across a number of different career metrics. As decision makers who are serving in this role for honors and recognition committees at AGU, you play an important role in supporting AGU's commitment to promoting equity and inclusion and the equitable recognition of scholars within your disciplines. Now, ethical and inclusive decision-making, I want to point out, is a process. It's not an outcome, it's a process, okay? And it's one that's predicated on principles of fairness and equity aimed at disrupting individual and systemic biases that we know are preventing the full achievement and participation of some groups in science. 4 assumptions underlie this approach to ethical and inclusive decision-making. First, people deserve to be evaluated fairly and equitably and based on their individual merits and characteristics without preference for or against their identities. Second, although biases may be fundamental to human cognition and judgment, they're not inevitable. We can do something to mitigate them. Third, active steps to mitigate these biases, whether the biases are intentional or unintentional, are necessary if we're going to ensure ethical and inclusive decision outcomes. And finally, decision makers have an ethical obligation to take steps to mitigate their own and other people's biases when they're evaluating candidates for whatever context they may be in. Now, understanding how to mitigate biases starts with an awareness of what bias is and how it might influence the way we think, feel, and respond to others. You're likely familiar with the common terms that social scientists use to describe different kinds of social biases, including stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Stereotypes are the beliefs that we have about another group's attributes, traits, or behaviors, what we expect people to be like if we know something about their group identities. Prejudice is defined by our attitudes or evaluative responses toward members of different social groups. So that's our gut reactions and affective reactions. Now, it's important to keep in mind that prejudice may be both positive and negative. Many of the biases that we observe in the workplace and in academic settings, including evaluative biases in hiring, advancement, and so forth, these things seem to be linked more to in-group favoritism rather than out-group loathing. Now, discrimination is the third component of prejudice, and that's the behavioral component. It's defined by whether and how we act on stereotypic beliefs or intergroup prejudices. Now, one of the most important shifts in our scientific understanding of bias has been the recognition that biases can operate outside of conscious awareness and without our intent. And that's because how we understand the world, including how we understand other people, is a function of 2 cognitive systems that operate in parallel. One of those cognitive systems, what Danny Kahneman has called the rabbit brain, operates reflexively, responding to the world relatively automatically, effortlessly, and largely outside of our conscious awareness. The other cognitive system, what he calls the tortoise brain, operates reflectively, responding to the world deliberatively, effortfully, and largely within our conscious awareness. Excuse me. Our rabbit brain allows us to execute well-learned responses in the background of our conscious attention. And this maximizes our ability to use our attentional resources to navigate the world around us. Now, the better we've learned something, the easier it becomes to do it automatically and reflexively. Riding a bike, for example, the first time takes a lot of focused attention not to fall down. But riding a bike the 100th time is usually something people can do without giving a lot of thought to it. Because biases, including stereotypes and prejudices, can also become well learned from the culture around us, they too can become reflexive responses, operating automatically and influencing judgment without our intent or our awareness. Mazar Banaji and Anthony Greenwald coined the term implicit biases to describe the thumbprint that culture leaves on cognition and to explain how that thumbprint can influence our evaluations of others beyond our intent or awareness. Even people who care about equality may hold and express unintended biases. For example, Greenwald and Banaji have demonstrated that all else being equal, we automatically perceive male names to be more famous than female names. Because men are more likely to receive recognition and fame in most societies, we develop a well-learned habit, and we assume that men are more likely to be famous than are women. This name-fame bias can get in our way and can lead us to make snap judgments about other people, including perhaps snap judgments about candidates who might be applying for honors and recognition. Now, research suggests that unlearning implicit biases like these can actually be quite challenging. We can, however, work to recognize and mitigate their impact when we evaluate other people, which we'll discuss today. Now, there are at least 3 pathways for biases to shape how we evaluate and make decisions about other people. First, when we evaluate other people, the inputs that we use to make decisions can be shaped both directly and indirectly by individual, organizational, institutional, and cultural biases. Systemic biases constrain people's opportunities, and that means what we see on people's resumes has been influenced by their own experiences with biases in the world around us. And many of the metrics that we use to capture merit can also reflect various kinds of biases. For example, letters of recommendation are especially likely to amplify the biases of those people who write them. Letters about women and people of color, for example, tend to be shorter, more likely to include irrelevant information, more likely to include biased language, and are less enthusiastic than letters for men and people who are white. For example, in a study of over 1,200 recommendation letters for geoscience postdocs, Coeli Dutt and colleagues found that women applicants were half as likely as men applicants to be described as excellent. Second, evaluating other people is an inherently cognitive task. In addition to implicit stereotypes and prejudice, several other cognitive and motivational kinds of biases can shape what we see, what we believe, and how we make sense of other people. For example, prestige biases can lead us to make snap judgments that favor candidates from highly prestigious programs. And when that's compounded with confirmation biases, it can lead us to selectively attend to and believe information that supports those preferences. To the extent women and people of color are less well represented at those kinds of institutions, prestige biases are compounded by gender, racial, and ethnic disparities. Now, finally, in academic and scientific settings, we tend to make important decisions in groups. Research suggests that group dynamics during deliberations can also afford opportunities for individual biases to prevail. Now, some factors have been shown to increase the risk of these kinds of biases, including things like time pressure, low accountability for explaining our decisions, and ambiguity. When we're in a hurry, we're more likely to rely on our gut reactions, including our stereotypes about other people. And if we're not accountable to explain our judgments, either to ourselves or to other people, that lack of accountability can lead us to lean into biases without even recognizing that we're doing so. Finally, when information is more ambiguous, either because candidate credentials are mixed or because it isn't clear what distinguishes candidates, maybe they're all equally fabulous, for example, we're likely to fill in the gaps or lean into our biases to try to make a decision. Other problematic practices in the process of evaluating people can increase the risk of bias as well. First, when there's little effort to ensure diversity in candidate pools, solo candidates capture our attention, and this can invite greater risk for implicit bias. Second, when reviewers lack clear evaluative criteria or they lack agreement over what the criteria mean, individual biases are more likely to shape how we define merit, and that can open the door for subjectivity and other biases. Furthermore, when reviewers lack consensus over how criteria can be weighted, shifting standards can emerge, and that opens the door for people to selectively lean into the importance of those criteria that might confirm their own candidate preferences. Now, reviewers' own habits for reviewing also can promote bias. For example, I confess to having done this when I was a junior person. We may be tempted to review the candidates we know first, right? We're looking through the pile of all the available candidates. We're trying to figure out where to start. And the names that capture our attention are likely to be people we know. But that means we're likely to be reviewing the people we don't know when we're more fatigued or simply tired and bored from our reviewing. Because our networks also tend to include more people who share our social identities compared to people who do not, this practice can lead to homophily or in-group favoritism. Finally, committees can come to premature closure about their decisions when they rank or rate candidates too early in the process. Committees often rate candidates to reduce the pool before a full group discussion. Now, when early rankings and ratings are shared publicly before deliberation, the decision about who won can seem like a foregone conclusion. And even if people strongly disagree with those top rankings, their disagreements may not be heard if they worry about going against the group's opinion. Once we see the names that have risen to the top, we're also at risk of confirmation biases because we tend to lean into supporting those outcomes. And that can sort of seal the proverbial deal when it comes to how we discuss candidates. So how can we mitigate these many sources of bias that might undermine equitable and inclusive decision-making? We're going to talk about 4 broad categories today. One of those categories has a lot of different pieces and parts. The first is building a better pool of candidates. The second is reducing time pressure. The third is creating accountability for equitable decisions, and that's where things get pretty complex. And then the fourth is managing ambiguity. So first, if there's no diversity in your candidate pool, it's pretty difficult to recognize diverse talent. So building strong and diverse pools of talented applicants takes time and effort. I understand that AGU's Honors and Recognition Program has implemented some canvassing committees as a strategy for addressing this issue, and that's an excellent approach. But everyone engaged in the honors and recognition processes should be working to elevate the nomination of candidates whose talent might broaden participation in the pool. Within the committee, we can also work to ensure candidate pools are representative before we begin to review. And we can do that by identifying sort of targets or benchmarks for recruiting. We can develop these benchmarks from national data. But we may need to work to oversample those groups that are underrepresented in order to overcome those contrast effects when it comes to having low diversity in the pool. If 50% of the pipeline is female, as it is in the geosciences, and although that varies a little bit across subdisciplines within the geosciences, we should be aiming for 50% female representation in most of our candidate pools, depending on what the cohorts are. Of course, if we're looking at people who are at later stages of their career, the representation might be slightly different. But because the number of geoscience PhDs awarded to scientists of color is overall very low and has remained low over time, it may be necessary to try to triple or even quadruple the representation in the pool relative to the proverbial pipeline if we're going to overcome some of those contrast effects. Second, we can increase diversity in the pool by ensuring our application processes welcome diversity and inclusion. Processes should be transparent, user-friendly, and support DEI values. When application processes are difficult to follow or to complete, everyone's less likely to follow through on nominations. But people may be especially likely to abandon nominations for historically minoritized individuals if they feel the cost-benefit ratio is simply too high. And women and people of color may be less likely to see themselves as successful candidates and therefore less willing to invest time in applying if they don't see that DEI values are front and center in the application process. Now, once the applications are in, we need to think about how much time we have to actually review them. We need to allow for enough time to have thorough review and discussion. Psychological research on the planning fallacy suggests that we're all prone to underestimating the amount of time that complex tasks require. Now, reviewing applications may seem pretty straightforward, but in fact, it is pretty difficult, right? There's a lot of information to make sense of, and we often don't allow enough time to do the job well, at least for every candidate. And frankly, reviewing is a service that we get little to no credit for. So it's easy for us to push that work off to the back burner and to do it at the last minute or to do it in the wee hours of the night because we're trying to fit it in around other responsibilities. And this, of course, can undermine our attention to candidates, and that can undermine equity. Now, how much time is required depends on how much information we ask for, but a good baseline to start with is about 20 to 30 minutes per candidate for the initial review. You may need more if you've asked for a lot of other information. If, for example, you're really going through people at the end of their career with lengthy resumes or CVs, or people who are providing manuscripts in support of their nomination, that's going to require even more time. If we rush that first pass, though, we're likely to lean into gut reactions rather than leaning into evidence about candidate credentials. Now, when it comes to deliberation, committees also need to allow enough time to really think about and deliberate the candidate's credentials. So oftentimes committees allot less than 15 minutes per candidate, and that's not enough. So if somebody spends 5 to 10 hours preparing their materials to send to you, you probably need more than 15 minutes to adequately discuss what's in front of you. Now, even if we spend a lot of time reviewing those materials, we can still end up confirming our gut reactions if we don't have clear and reliable criteria for evaluating candidates. So it's important to create some accountability by first agreeing upon criteria for evaluation before we review anyone. One of the mistakes I see a lot of committees make is they open up the materials and let people start looking at the materials before they've agreed on any criteria for evaluation. The criteria that we determine to be of importance should be directly relevant to and linked to the kinds of information that candidates can and will provide in their submissions. So when we include criteria that aren't linked to what's in the application materials, we run the risk of filling in gaps in the materials with our own biases and assumptions. So that's another challenge that people face in coming up with a good rubric. I also recommend that committees work to calibrate how they are going to use those criteria by discussing and noting what the criteria mean and what different ratings on those dimensions mean to everybody in the group. What is excellent when it comes to evidence of impact in the field? What does that mean to you? What's a 5 on a scale of 1 to 5 for excellence? What's a 2? What's a 1? What evidence will be considered? When people within the committee have different definitions of excellence or merit, they will use the rating scales in more varied ways, and research suggests that this tends to penalize historically underrepresented group members. So unreliable use of the scales leads to more inequity. On a related note, the committee needs to agree not only on what the criteria are, but which criteria are most important. Knowing that one dimension is weighted as 40% and another is 20% ensures that people don't slip and slide in how they use the criteria when they're evaluating candidates. And that's another way of mitigating bias. Finally, the process for evaluation needs to be discussed and confirmed and transparent. When will the materials be available? For how long? How will people submit their evaluations? To whom? Who can see the ratings and rankings at what time? When committee members don't have good clarity, their own confusion can undermine equity as well. Now, beyond the rubrics, there needs to be someone on every committee who's charged with holding the group accountable to an equitable process. And that starts with using the criteria appropriately during the discussion. This could be the committee chair, or it could be a rotating responsibility. But whomever it is, this process advocate person needs to have the confidence and authority to interrupt when there are challenges to equity. If people aren't using the criteria as agreed upon, are introducing irrelevant information, relying on information that's not in the application, or expressing opinions without evidence, these behaviors need to be stopped and labeled and acknowledged. The group needs to focus instead on available evidence of strengths and weaknesses, but perhaps focusing more on strengths. And that's because research shows that when we frame discussions as trying to identify talent and keeping that talent in the pool as long as possible, we're more likely to lean away from our stereotypes and more likely to lean in toward equitable outcomes. Now, the process advocate person should also hold the group accountable to good participation norms. This person should monitor whether and how much people are participating so that everybody has a chance to weigh in. One strategy for ensuring equitable participation is to make sure that senior people speak last, okay? It can be hard for more junior voices in a committee to participate when the senior voices start the conversation. Research suggests we're likely to get a more complete picture of a candidate onto the table for discussion, meaning we'll share more information, if a junior voice starts. Now, when senior voices begin, the other challenge here is that their opinions can have undue sway on the conversation, and that can limit the introduction of new information that might be at odds with their own evaluations. Finally, we all probably do this, but it bears noting that we should make sure that ratings, rankings, and voting should be anonymous so that people don't feel pressured to vote with the herd. Okay, so the entire group, not just the process monitor, should be responsible for recognizing and calling out bad group dynamics, including interruptions, bullying, or incivility, and other power plays that can happen in these group settings. Bandwagon effects are another kind of a phenomena that we have to pay attention to. They're a little harder to recognize and monitor. The key here is that bandwagon effects occur when somebody starts saying that they favor someone or disfavor someone, and other people start jumping in line behind them and agreeing. Once we hear a lot of agreement and we don't hear any discussion of anything that's disagreement, we might want to pay attention to that and ask ourselves, are we jumping on the bandwagon here? Maybe we need to work to broaden our perspective of the candidate if that's happening. Other bad dynamics include rushing to closure. When you hear people in a committee saying, I'm in a hurry, we don't have time to do this, those are signals that people are likely to not be engaged in what they're doing. And perhaps the meeting should stop and resume when everybody can participate more fully. Now, we should all also work to hold one another accountable for equitable deliberation and discussion. And this includes avoiding relying on those quantitative metrics or letters of recommendation, for example, that might reflect other people's biases. We should also work to label gender, racial, and other biases when they emerge. When we recognize them, acknowledge them, we can stop, pause, reflect, and figure out how we're going to correct. One hidden bias we need to keep an eye out for that I think is sort of underappreciated is a tendency to split hairs over trivial candidate differences in ways that support the status quo. So is there really a difference between publishing 46 or 48 papers? Not really. Is there really a big difference between someone who gets a grant for $400,000 or $450,000? Probably not, particularly if their disciplines are different. There might even be no difference between someone who gets a grant for $50,000 and someone who gets a $500,000 grant, because what they do doesn't require the same amount of resources. But the point here is that when it's hard to choose between candidates, we may find ourselves leaning toward evidence, particularly things that look quantitative on the surface. We may find ourselves leaning toward evidence that favors the status quo because we feel more confident in those numbers, even if they don't really speak to people's merit. Similarly, we should be avoiding future casting. This is another problem that comes up. Where we start to anticipate how candidates are likely to be in the future, what they're likely to accomplish in the future. We tend to give the benefit of the doubt to status quo candidates, that is men and people who are white. So future casting can also lead to inequalities. And finally, we need to hold ourselves and the group accountable for tracking the pool. If 20% of the pool is women at the start and no women end up on the short list, we might want to backtrack and take a look at our notes and ask ourselves if we're evaluating people in an equitable way. Now, obviously, when we are evaluating candidates and we're deliberating as a group, we want to discuss all candidates and we want to document what we're discussing so that we can go back and review our conversation if we need to. Now, in deciding how to organize that discussion, we should work to mitigate anchoring our evaluations on the early front runners. We're more likely to exclude diverse talent if we begin with a discussion of who's at the top. It's helpful here to postpone ranking and rating people as long as possible. But of course, sometimes we're dealing with very large initial pools of candidates, and we need some reliable strategy for narrowing the pool. So we may use a rating structure early in the process. When we do that, it's important to try to minimize the risk of premature closure and making a decision about who lands in the top in that first pass before we've discussed anyone. And we can do that by anonymizing the absolute outcomes of our ratings and rankings and sharing only broader groupings of candidates with the committee. So what that might look like is everybody rates the candidates using the rubric. And then they give their ratings to a third party or to the chair who summarizes that information and then organizes people into groups in the top third, the middle third, and the bottom third, and presents those groupings in alphabetic order to the committee. So rather than presenting them in the order of the ratings, which can cause people to anchor in on, okay, that person's at the top, that must be the person we're going to select, we can get people to just focus on who's still in contention rather than who's at the top. Now, people can, as I was saying, people can see who's in contention rather than sort of focusing on that first pass who's ranked at the top, which can lead to that premature closure. Now, beyond group accountability, we all need to work to hold ourselves accountable for our own gut preferences and reactions. So we need to learn to recognize when we're having that kind of a gut reaction. I'll give you an example of a gut reaction I caught myself on pretty early in my career, and that was people who went to the same graduate program I went to. Right. So when I would see their applications for graduate school, I would kind of go, oh, they went to my alma mater. But that's a bias, right? And the people who go to my alma mater might be more likely to look like me. And so that can replicate homophily and in-group favoritism. So we need to pay attention to those gut reactions and try to mitigate their impact on our evaluations and recognize when they might be creating conflicts of interest, and we should excuse ourselves. Other steps we can take include reviewing candidates in random order and being prepared to justify our own evaluations. So research has shown that when we anticipate that we have to explain ourselves to other people, it forces us to be data-driven. So it forces us to actually look at the credentials and use the credentials. And so that's a good strategy. So taking notes, take notes when you evaluate people. Don't just read their materials without writing something down. One additional note, don't fall prey to objectivity bias. Research has demonstrated that the more we see ourselves as fair and objective, the more likely we are to be biased in our evaluations. This is an ironic sort of phenomena. Ullman and Cohen, for example, found that people were more likely to favor male job applicants over equally qualified female applicants only when they were asked to think about being objective first. So this bias only emerged when they were thinking, I'm a fair and objective person. So what this means is when we go into the process of evaluating candidates, it's better to say something like, I'm prone to bias like anyone else. I need to work to be equitable, and not to say to ourselves, I'm a fair person, I'm going to be objective, okay? Because the latter is really unrealistic when we think about ourselves that way. Now, the final thing we need to keep in mind as a committee is that ambiguity can force people to rush to closure and make premature decisions. And when we do that, again, we're more likely to lean into biases. So how can we do that? We can do that by learning to manage ambiguity and tolerate uncertainty. Now, it can be difficult to tolerate uncertainty. When we look at the stack of all the people we're trying to evaluate, we want to make a decision. That's what we're there to do, right? We want to get it done. But not knowing who will rise to the top, we need to be willing to tolerate that uncertainty long enough to fully evaluate the pool before we make a decision. If we start leaning into saying, I know who's going to be the one, then there's a good chance that we will have a lot of confirmation biases in the discussion. So we need to hold off and be patient with that uncertainty. It also helps to recognize that ambiguity can lead to bias in other ways. For example, when we acknowledge that uncertainty about qualifications of underrepresented candidates is likely to make us more hesitant to support them, if we can acknowledge that, then we can get that on the table and sort of address whether or not we are leaning away from someone for the wrong reasons. One way we can do this quantitatively is we can look at those ratings that people make. We know that when there's more bias introduced in the metrics, that the ratings across reviewers will be more variable. So if you look across reviewers on your rubric and look at the different evaluation metrics, if you find candidates who have highly varied ratings across your reviewers, that's a good sign that maybe something's going on. People are not using the rubric consistently, and you can use that information to foster discussion about those candidates. Finally, we can work to recognize when we might be at risk of homophily when we're splitting hairs. When things are more uncertain, when candidates are equally wonderful, it is really difficult to make a decision, and that's a form of uncertainty. And when we're in that position, what we tend to do is find all kinds of trivial information that we'll use to make a decision. And typically that trivial information favors the status quo. So recognizing that potential risk and putting it on the table is a good thing to do. And that's all I have to say. And I actually got done in 30 minutes, which is like a record for me. So we have time for discussion, and I'm ready for people to start sending questions my way.
Yeah, so thank you, Stephanie. That was great. So I think we can take down the slide and let people come on camera, if you would. There have been a lot of questions in the chat box, but at this point, let's just ask people to use the raise your hand function, if you would, to be recognized for some questions. But before we get to those, there are some questions about availability of this information. So this recording will be made available, so you can go back and review this at any time in the future. We will also have additional modules that gives additional details on all the points that Stephanie covered. So let's just see who has their hand up. Okay, John Balbus.
Thanks very much, and thanks for a great presentation. I'm just thinking about, various settings in addition to the one that we're focused on here. But, sometimes we may perceive a bias or think that we're perceiving a bias in somebody on a committee with us, and they may not perceiving the bias. So do you have any suggestions for how to kind of resolve a conflict about whether or not bias is operating in a very specific situation? That seems like a challenging kind of thing.
Well, there are a couple of things I would suggest. First of all, it's good practice for all committees to have shared training about what bias is and what it looks like. It makes it easier for people to then have a conversation when it comes up, because they can reflect back on the training, right? So when your colleague is doing something and you've already had a conversation in the training, you can say, that's reminding me of what we talked about in that training. I'm wondering if that could be happening here. The other thing I would say is depersonalize it, focus on behavior, not the person. People become more defensive and they're less likely to hear our concerns if they feel like we're accusing them of intending to be biased. And so I would say it's always better to say, I'm concerned that in this moment, we're not giving full consideration to this other aspect of the candidate. So redirecting people to what we need them to focus on, that's another strategy we can use to try to mitigate that. When people start, getting at loggerheads, then we've got a problem, right? And that happens. I've seen that happen in hiring committees. I've seen it in promotion committees. Somebody's decided already what they want, what their decision is, and we're not going to make headway. That's a challenge too, but that's another form of bias. That's premature closure. And asking people, I worry that we've already made a decision before we've deliberated fully about the candidates. That's another strategy we can use. It's not easy. I mean, you asked a really hard question, first question, but I hope that those strategies might give you some tools that you can start with. So,
thank you.
Okay, John Selker, I think your hand is up next.
Thank you very much. Stephanie, really enjoyed the presentation, took pages of notes. The thing that comes forward so often is that these are not anonymous applicants. We're not dealing with young faculty who are unknown. So on our committees, typically there's deep personal relationship with the bulk of these people we're considering. So I'm thinking back to a committee I served on, the Horton Medal Committee, and my advisor was a nominee. And I said, well, I should excuse myself from this conversation. The chair of the committee said quite the opposite. He said, well, I want you to advocate. And so I was very, I'm very conflicted, because on the one hand, yes, we have inside information, but on the other hand, it's not what's in the package. And so how do we balance a lifetime of knowing these people compared to what's written on the page?
Well, and I think there's another challenge that you may be alluding to as well. Sometimes we know things about people that really suggest they shouldn't be moving forward, right? Because we may know about bad behavior that violates AGU's ethics principles, right? And that's not been reported somewhere, but now what do we do? Right? We know it, we've seen it, we've witnessed it, but it's not out there and it's not part of the package. So what do we do? I think first of all, you were probably, I would have suggested that your inclination to recuse yourself from the discussion about that candidate was appropriate. It's very difficult. That's why NSF, for example, will ask you who have you advised, right? Before you review a grant, because we know that this kind of relationship makes it very hard for people to be objective. And so I would say that's typically a good practice to recognize those conflicts of interest. But beyond that, what we can do is work to keep people on track and not let people introduce information that's not in the packet. So if it's not in the packet, we don't use it, right? I'm not going to use the fact that 5 years ago I was at a meeting and we had this great discussion. That's not going to be introduced as evidence, right? We sort of treat this like a legal court of law, and we say these are the pieces of information we're allowed to use. And whenever we find ourselves leaning into conversations about those other things, we need to call and we need to check ourselves and ask ourselves, how is that relevant to what this discussion is about? Is it information that everybody in the process has had a chance to share, or is it going to lead to favoritism in a way that disadvantages those candidates who, for reasons of homophily in networks, right, we may not know, right? There may be a really talented person in that pool whom very few people know, right? That person's finally been nominated and recognized, but maybe they're not close friends with the people on the committee because our networks tend to look like us, right? And so that's another challenge we have to be honest with ourselves about, and be careful not to say, I'm choosing this person because I like them, right? I need to be choosing people because there's real evidence in the packet that they're the people who should be recognized. Does that help?
It does. It doesn't quite address the question of what to do about negative information that one has.
Yeah, so the negative information, I
think
think there needs.
It also doesn't deal with the fact that you said that women's letters tend to be less glowing. And so we've got the information in front of us, but we are saying, well, these are probably 50% less positive. So it doesn't, doesn't quite deal with the whole package.
Let me see if I can hit both of those things. First thing I would say is you need to have a formal process that allows all of the committees to acknowledge if somebody should not be nominated because of an ethical violation. So there needs to be a formal process for your committee for people to anonymously say, I have a concern about this person's ethic, they violated AGU's ethics policies in some way, and there's some process for evaluating that and deciding whether or not they should stay in the pool. Because there may be a candidate who's managed to sort of skate through their careers with lots of bad behavior and get away with it. And we don't want to recognize and honor those people, right? So there has to be a process within your organization for what you do, and what the committee understands is that process. So is there a form that people go through, and when you're doing your rubric, I have a concern about an ethical violation, and those things go to Billy's office, and sorry, Billy, I just made work for you. Billy's going, stop, Stephanie, stop now. But maybe Billy's office needs to have a way to adjudicate and make a decision about whether those candidates stay in the pool for consideration. But that takes time. Again, you have to afford time for that. With regard to the letters, I think what we have to do is we have to be willing to go through and say, I'm not going to over interpret enthusiasm differences between male and female candidates, right? I'm not going to lean into, well, this person said this person was excellent and this person said this person was good. Well, I don't know good and excellent. I know that there's a gender bias there. If letters look really biased, then we do have to consider dropping them out, throwing them out. With regard to anonymizing some processes, that can be helpful, but as you said, it's really difficult when we're looking at people in this kind of a context. We know who they are, like their packets tell us who they are, so we can't anonymize that, but we can acknowledge how those things could be swaying our perceptions and ask ourselves, should the letter sway me? Should I believe this person? If this person says 4 things about this woman's personality and nothing about her credentials, should I take this letter seriously at all? Is this person actually commenting on something that's relevant?
Yeah, so let's go to another. That's very good. We had said earlier this was going to end at 45 minutes. I don't want to cut off this rich discussion. If people have time to continue on, Stephanie, if you have time as well. Let's go another.
I have 10, time until 1.
Okay,
I'm good.
Let's go another 10, 15 minutes or so. We could. There was an earlier question that came in the chat, and I think it was around the process of withholding names, not even knowing the names of the nominees. Whether that's a process or like a blind selection.
Yeah, so blind review is just really challenging in our roles. Like people give us their resume, like if you take the names off of their publications, we still know what the publication is. And so our disciplines are so niche, and we tend to know what people do and hear them present at conferences. So we recognize their work. I think it's better for us to just acknowledge those risk of homophily or risk of favoritism for people we know, and say, I'm too close to this person. I'm going to step back and let other people speak first. Right. So rather than trying to anonymize, I'm too close. I'd like for us to start with somebody who doesn't know this person as well. I think we might get more information on the table that way. Think of it as your goal is to get as much information out about the person as possible. Right. The more information you share, the better your decision is likely to be.
Yeah. Sybil, I saw your hand earlier, but it's down. Did you have a question?
No, it was asked earlier
Okay,
about, yeah, no, thank you very much.
okay. And Adina, you had a hand up and now it's down. Did you have a question?
Well, I think John asked that for me. What about bad behavior that we are aware of that is not reflected in the packages and I feel has to be discussed because nobody is going to put in the letters something maybe they're not aware of, but these are supportive letters. So so the package does not include the negative stuff typically.
Yeah, you typically don't send out a request and say, and please submit your concerns as well, right? That's typically not the approach. And so,
and the suggestion Stephanie made about bringing those concerns forward to ethics staff through our office, through staff or through your staff contact, is the appropriate thing to do. And we'll try to work with you to get those resolved. So David, I see your hand up.
What my first question was the same one that John asked, which has been answered. How do you deal if you know there's unethical behavior that hasn't been notified? You know, like there's some people that you know, are pretty abusive to their women graduate students and never finish a woman graduate student, and you know, you don't want to honor one of those people. But I guess I want to go back to this conversation that was in the chat that Alan started, because we're all evaluating people based on. I assume that we're going to get this is my first year on a selection committee for a fellow. So I assume we're going to get a list of criteria, and I assume the list is, you know, demonstrating scientific excellence and leadership in the field internationally, and you know, just like in tenure, there's 3 categories you have to. In 2 out of 3 you have to demonstrate excellence in. One of them is, you know, scholarship. One of them is international leadership, and the other one is service. And service is really broad. It's outreach, it's you know, diversity and inclusion. All these things count in service, and you know, that can be one of the two categories that you demonstrate excellence is. So I guess I want to go back and say, you know, what are the criteria? Presumably be given us a sheet, and Alan suggested that they're changing, and I guess since we're all here and we're all on fellow selection committees, it seems like this would be a good time to talk about what they're changing to and why they're changing.
well, Artisha, has her hand up. So.
We'll let Artisha answer that, but this is not a discussion about what the criteria should be for fellow selection. That's not what this presentation is about, but I'll turn it over to Artisha to answer.
Thank you. So thank you, David, and thanks, Alan and Raina, for bringing that up. Let me just say for this particular piece, those discussions are still at the governance level. They haven't been moved forward yet. So they aren't for this year's selection. For everyone joining any selection committee. So today we have a mixture. We invited 300 people. We had upwards of 140 people from all levels. So it's not just fellows folks here today. It is the union level and also some of the section awards. As we move forward with it's not a changing of the criteria, just adding some context, language. The council has recently had a discussion about it, and that's what you saw in the chat, and H&R committee, honors and recognition committee members are here too. So they were in the chat kind of commenting. As we work through the rest of this year, there will be discussion at the governance level with the council and the board around your question, David. What does that look like? How do we evaluate it? And then this new expansion with training materials and evaluation materials will move forward for 2022. So we have some time. We will be bringing back to the fellows, to AGU members and others, but it's very early in the process to say, how will we use this to select the fellows? So we are working through that. LaToya started this. She's the chair of the Honors and Recognition Committee, as well as John Geisman. I don't know if John's on the call, but the Union Fellows Chair will be working together with the council for evaluation.
I think
let me just say, I put the criteria in the chat. They're written down. They're from an AGU webpage. They do not include service. So David, look at the actual criteria that have been around for a while.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you, Alan. I'm going to copy that and put it in a document. The follow-up question I had based on the presentation, though, was in the committees I've served in the past, where we're selecting like a young scholar. one thing that's been really valuable is we always had a rubric, and you said that's important. Do you provide templates for rubrics for fellow committees, or does each committee kind of make their own?
I can't answer what the committees do. I can tell you, you need to have one. And so,
Okay.
Artisha, are you going to answer that?
So yeah, I'll just answer this to say, David, and for all the new folks joining us, there is an actual detailed orientation for each of you all for your various roles, where we will go over evaluation, how we go about doing that, what we look for with that, as well as the systems for that. So you should be getting appointments or should have appointments for those trainings. That's the section and Union Fellows training, as well as all of the various awards that you're on. So we'll go through those things.
I do want to put in a quick note that the sustained scientific impact criteria is going to begin to present challenges, particularly for women and women who have school-age children as a result of the pandemic. And also for people of color who might have been burdened with additional service around addressing racial issues in their communities following racial reckoning last summer. And so all of those things have increased the demands on people's time. We know a number of reports have come out and have documented that women who have childcare or caregiving responsibilities have been impacted twice as much in terms of lost time for productivity compared to men. They're submitting fewer papers compared to men in most disciplines, not all. And so one of the challenges we're going to have to figure out is how do we operationalize sustained scientific impact in the context. This applies for awards and honors, but also for hiring, promotion on our campuses. We're going to have to really think about what does it mean to give people grace for the external constraints that were well beyond their control in the past year? Because if sustained criteria, right, we know that women are not going to look the same as men. We just know that right now. We can see it right now that their pipelines have been disrupted far more than men's have. So,
Yeah.
You're right, but that's only one of the criteria. It doesn't have to be sustained impact.
right. I'm just saying that's something we all need to be sort of thinking about from here forward for junior faculty right now. For junior colleagues, we need to be thinking about it. But as things move forward, we're really going to have to be asking ourselves, how has the pandemic impacted people's career trajectories in disparate ways that are beyond their control?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I think we're close to the end. Is there one or two more questions we can take before we close down? Alphonse?
Yes, hello. Hi. Yeah, so this is again kind of a general question, but I was a little confused by something that Stephanie had said, so I thought you might clarify that. There was some mention about the amount of time we should give to the candidates, and so some candidates, she said, might perhaps submit some additional manuscripts or something, and so that would require more time. But isn't there a limit, or shouldn't there be a limit on the materials that can be submitted so that we don't have a lot of manuscripts or extra material?
Yeah, absolutely. There should be a structured process. I'm simply saying that for some kinds of honors and recognition, you might request different levels of material. So if you're looking at something that's to capture someone's entire career, you need more than 20, 30 minutes to look at all of the materials. And if you're looking at somebody at early career, the chances are what you have in front of you for everyone is not as significant, is not as big a stack, right? And so that's what I was simply trying to say is don't limit yourself to that low number. Be sure to be thoughtful about how much time it really takes to read and thoughtfully understand someone's credentials.
Yeah. So yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And certainly if it is a late career type thing, then presumably everyone would be submitting a lot of materials. And if they don't, then they might not make the cut. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, so we are about 10 minutes past our plans in time, but I think this has been a very, very rich discussion. There will be an evaluation form posted you will receive from Leah concerning this session. So please respond to that. And Leah, you will also receive additional information from Leah concerning the posting of additional supporting information around Stephanie's presentation today. So you will see slides and other information that provides even more detail on what you received today. But Stephanie, thank you so much for an excellent session. I use the word excellent because it was excellent. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for being here. And thank you for your service again to AGU, for service on the selection committees. I think this is one of the most important functions you have across the organization. So really appreciate you being on. Leah, do you have any closing comments before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank everyone for participating. I thought it was really beneficial and a lot of good discussion and information. And I thought Stephanie did a really great job. So we would definitely try to get this out to you all within the next couple of days, especially with the evaluation. And for any chairs that are on this live session right now, this will go out to everyone, even those who aren't able to participate today. So.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Billy, do you want to stick around for just a minute or?
I can,
okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. When the room is so big, I can't talk to everyone.